Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph Lamb. Good to be with you this morning or this afternoon or whenever you happen to be watching this. I'm coming to you from the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Center in Gig Harbor. And yes, we do have sun today. It is sunny outside the window. Spring has finally kind of hit us. This is our second in our series on women's health, current series that we're running. Today's topic is nutrition for optimal health. And indeed, we're going to be moving forward with this series over the next couple Thursdays. We will do the next lecture, which is bioidentical hormone therapy, next Thursday, the 22nd of April. We're going to take a pause on the 29th of April because I'll actually be out of town. And then on the 6th, we'll be covering nutritional and botanical support for women's health. And on the 13th of May, we'll cover self-care and stress management. Other series that we've got going on, we've got a lunch and learn today on cardiovascular concerns, and we're touching off a 5-week series on cardiovascular health beginning next Monday, the 19th of April at 11 a.m. And that's going to be a similar series to this one. So let's talk about nutrition. Today specifically, we're going to be talking about the power of food and the power of a food plan to help achieve our wellness goals and to help support us through kind of the medical conditions that we have. You know, really, when you think about it, wellness and optimal wellness is more than the simple absence of disease. I think we would all accept that fact and take it as a pretty straightforward kind of acknowledgement. But if it is, then we have to think about achieving that wellness, not as a destination, not as something that's static, but indeed thinking about it more as a journey, with its ups and downs and its back and forths. And we'll do a fair bit more discussing that kind of stages of change model and that movement in our fifth in this series. But the point is that to presume that there is one food plan that is good for all stages of a woman's life, or even to presume that there's one food plan that's good for all women, is to make some gross simplifications about our individuality, our biochemical individuality, our individuality in terms of our life experiences, our individuality in terms of the environments in which we live. All of these things play a definitive role. On as simple of a level as the genes that play a role in methylation, for example, the genes really help determine how much folic acid we need and whether we need the activated kind of natural form of folic acid, the 5-methyl form, versus the plain folic acid. And that's why they make a distinction about how much of what do we need in our diet. And, that's a genetic influence, whether we, grew up in a rural setting versus whether we, or city setting, whether we lived someplace that was toxic, whether we're living someplace that's toxic now, or whether we're living someplace with good food supplies or not good food supplies. All of these factors play a role in terms of the diet that we want to eat and partake of. as a good basic rule, thinking about nutrition, you should think about, before picking a specific food plan, you should think about the specifics by which food plans are sort of described. At the biggest level, when we think about food plans, for most of us, the first thing we think about is the amount and types of food. And, that kind of comes down at a certain point to a caloric discussion. And for a long time, the FDA and the Department of Agriculture in this country has focused upon calorie as being the primary distinction about what happens. There is a relatively simple equation that if you have an excess of 3,500 calories in a week, you're going to gain about a pound of weight. And that the presumption behind that is that a calorian is either burned or stored, and there's not much else that, there's not much influence on how we handle those calories or what we do with those calories. And, if there's an excess of 3,500 calories, we turn it into fat and we store it away. Well, it's kind of an oversimplification because we can affect our metabolic rate, and the type of calories have influences upon what we do with them. And, we can still be malnourished if we have enough calories, but we're missing certain nutrients. So, for example, if we're missing selenium or zinc or vitamin D, our thyroid function may not be as good as it could be. Or, when you start thinking about another way of looking at food, kind of the macronutrient content, we would all recognize the fact that if we ate a pound of jelly beans, it's going to have a different impact upon our system than if we ate a pound of butter, which would have a different impact than if we were to eat a pound of veggies, like a salad. Some tomatoes and some carrots and some zucchini and some cucumber and some lettuce and some spinach and, all of that. And if you ate a pound of that sort of food, the impact is clearly different. And, it's different because of the presence of fats and proteins and carbohydrates, but it's also different because of the different quality of those fats and proteins and carbohydrates. When it comes to a carbohydrate, the ease of digestion or the ease of absorption leads to kind of it influences the rapidity of how fast our blood sugar goes up, that the spiking of that curve. And the faster our blood sugar spikes, the faster our insulin spikes, and hence kind of the faster that we end up getting, the faster that we end up getting the kind of elevation that leads to inflammatory changes and leads to higher insulin levels and can lead us to be pre-diabetic. And, and obviously the influences that it has on, our whole endocrine system and our hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, and thyroid axis, the adrenal gland, cortisol playing a role in maintaining our energy levels as we're under persistent stress or resolving from persistent stress. Protein is so important for us. Not only does protein get used as a source of energy, but proteins are what we build things out of. So when we build our muscle, when we build brain tissue, when we build heart, when we build whatever it may be, any structure that we build, even all the little structures within a cell, we need proteins to build them. and so we need those building blocks of the amino acids, and we need to eat complete proteins. And so, that's part of the challenge, when you're eating a vegetarian diet, depending which proteins you're eating, are you getting a complete protein? Like when we think about shakes, either just a simple protein shake, a functional food, or we get into a description of a medical food with a longer therapeutic goal and maybe some therapeutically active pieces. A big discussion frequently is the protein source. Is it soy? Is it dairy? Where's that protein coming from? And there is a lot of attention these days to doing rice and pea. They're less inflammatory, they're sustainable, they're they don't have some of the issues that we associate with the allergenicity of either the milk or the soy. It's not going to be soy protein that could potentially be coming from GMO sources. So you look at all these things, but you have to look at the protein building capacity, and the amino acid profile of a rice or pea-based protein is not the same as a whey-based or a soy-based. And so you may need to supplement with the branched-chain amino acids. And you'll find a distinction between cheaper and more expensive medical foods or protein shakes is that they've added the branched-chain amino acids, which help us build complete muscles and help us build enzymes and help us build all the things that we need to build out of protein. And then finally, there's the quality of fats. I think most of us are aware of saturated fats. Most of us are aware of polyunsaturated fats and monosaturated fats. And the more saturated a fat is, and what we mean by saturation is instead of there being carbon double bonds between the carbons in the chain, that there are more side groups, more hydrogens coming off to either side. And saturated fats are potentially more inflammatory. Saturated fats are potentially a little bit more atherogenic, meaning the potential to cause plaque. And instead, we've had the move towards polyunsaturated fats. But we have to pick the right ones. And then we get into a discussion about whether that polyunsaturated fat is a trans fat or a cis fat, the cis fat being the naturally occurring structure and the trans fats being the structures that were created deliberately in a lab. And the reason for creating those kind of trans fats were they maintain solidity at room temperature. So you could take, whereas we're all used to butter with a fairly high saturated fat content being a solid at room temperature, a polyunsaturated fat like safflower oil or sunflower oil, we could potentially end up in a situation in which we have a liquid at room temperature. So if you modify the chemical structure of that fat, what you end up with is a solid at room temperature. And it's actually interesting, German scientists under the Nazi regime were some of the first to make trans fats back in the day that the Germans were trying to make the Nazis were trying to make the German people feel like they weren't having all of these shortages of food and the such like. So trans fats were the substitute for butter. And there's a lot of discussion lately, and and part of the issue that we have to look at in terms of fats is what their source is. Butter has been discounted because it's saturated fat, and fats in general have been discounted as causing heart disease. But we have need for fats, and if we're getting omega-3 fatty acids, the EPA, DHA of the classic fish oil, then that's much better than the forms that are the omega-6 fats that come from eating corn, for example. And so, we think of fish as having omega-3, and we don't typically think about animals like poultry or beef or pig having those fats. And what we've come to recognize is that we now are in a place where the reason they don't is because of the way we raise our animals. When we feed chickens corn, they're going to have a lower omega-3 content. When we take a cow that's been raised and has been free-ranged and it's eating grasses, it's going to have a relatively high omega-3 content. But when we instead feed it corn and keep it penned up, then, particularly on a feedlot, right before we're ready to butcher it, then we're getting a high omega-6 content. And omega-6 is generally pro-inflammatory, and omega-3 is generally anti-inflammatory. And, whereas the ratio in the diet of our ancestors, even just a few hundred years ago, and particularly our hunter-gatherer ancestors, whereas the ratio maybe was 4-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3, or 3-to-1, we've now gotten to a point where the standard American diet can be as high as 30 to 40-to-1, and kind of a prudent diet can nonetheless be even 10 to 20-to-1 for that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So we want to change that, and we want to eat the right sort of foods. So in the final category that we want to pay attention to about our food when making choices more generally about food plans is the information molecules that are in food. That comment about we are what we eat is certainly true. I mean, if you eat some protein and you get an amino acid and it becomes part of a protein within you, you clearly have made yourself up out of the blocks that you've eaten. But there are, particularly in plants, there are information molecules which don't have direct nutritional value. Like if you eat a cruciferous vegetable and get some of the sulforaphane sprouts, etc. If you eat those and you get in some of the compounds that influence metabolism, either improve hepatic metabolism or compounds that change the way we handle estrogens and the metabolism of estrogens, when we do that, we're not, we don't burn that molecule for energy. We don't use it as a building block for something ourselves, but it's an information molecule that impacts kind of our sensing system and tells us whether the world's a safe world or a dangerous world. And it influences the choices we make in terms of metabolism in that regard. Compounds as simple as some of the bitter agents. When you consider things like hops or consider things like berberine or, some of the catechins from green tea, all of these play a role in influencing kinases, signaling molecules that kind of, recognize the stress that we're under, how much energy we have to burn, how much immune function we have to do. And, berberine, for example, specifically targets AMPK kinase right in the middle of that energy regulation piece. Some of the hops compounds playing a role in blocking some of the kind of upregulated inflammatory messages. All of these things play a role in determining who we are. If you don't have enough rosmarinic acid, for example, from rosemary and other plants, then you don't have the ability for your thyroid hormone to bind to the thyroid hormone receptor, the response element on the DNA, for example, as you would ideally like. So when we think about our food plans, we've got to think about where we are. We got to think about the caloric load and how much energy we're going to be burning. We've got to think about the quality of the macronutrients and what the proportion is of the macronutrients, because that's a big determination on a diet. Obviously, when we say low fat, that's going to be a diet with less fat. When we say low carbohydrate, it's going to be a diet with less carbohydrates. And proportionally, those percentages change depending which food plan you're looking at. And then, the types of those macronutrients, and then the amounts of the micronutrients that are present, and then finally the amounts of phytonutrients that are present. So what are our big, kind of diet choices that we have in front of us when you think about diet? Well, one is to eat the standard American diet, and that name is used because the acronym is SAD, S-A-D, and it allows us to make some judgments about the fact that kind of the commercialization of the Western diet, the increase of processed food, the easy access to fast food, et cetera, has created some real dietary challenges for us. And, what's happened, the growth of new to nature molecules, chemicals which didn't exist 100 years ago, which exist now, and many of those have been created to be part of the food process, preservatives, things to be flavor enhancers, things to, create, like all the artificial non-nutritive sweeteners. And, you would think, for example, that great, having something that tastes sweet that doesn't raise my blood sugar should be good, right? But it's been demonstrated, for example, that saccharin has negative impact on the mitochondria in the beta cell in the pancreas that's responsible for releasing insulin. And because it causes mitochondrial stress, the cell responds by excreting more insulin, and it creates a high insulin level, not because there was a calorie there, but because of the chemical stress involved, throwing off the oxidative reductive balance. So, as we look at all of these pieces, we pick together what we should ideally eat. We move away from that, great experiment that we've been doing for the last 50 years that, was originally associated with lengthening life expectancies. But, now due to obesity and the causes of obesity, which aren't just caloric excess or eating the wrong types of food, but probably also include the environmental toxicities, the generation of children, I think it was O'Shaughnessy's article, the generation of children born in the last decade well, 2 decades ago now, born like this paper goes back to like 2006. It basically suggests that life expectancies are going to be dropping for our children. They're not going to live as long as we do because of the fact that we have more obesity and more diabetes. So what is an ideal diet? Well, if we think about the diet being one of the biggest influences on us, it's an external influence. Every single day we're exposing our immune system. Every single day, we're exposing our gut and all the bacteria that are down there, the microbiome, that kind of shared community. And that influences our immune system and influences our neurologic system. All of that's influenced by the foods that we take in. And so when we do this, we have the potential for taking in toxins or heavy metals. Hence, why we, suggest not to, not to eat foods that are, quote, dirty. Hence, the Environmental Working Group has looked at veggies, for example, to help us. Ideally, everything we ate would be raised in a natural fashion. Everything we ate would be raised organically. But the reality of it is that may not be sustainable yet. We may not be able to grow enough food using those techniques to support everybody who's alive. So the Environmental Working Group has the Dirty Dozen and has the Clean 15. So recommendations for foods, veggies, fruits that should always be eaten organically, and the ones that we can eat that have been raised commercially but don't present a lot of risk to us. Michael Lerner from Commonweal, speaking in the late 1990s, early 2000s, talked about that the biggest the biggest reproductive rights issue of the 21st century was not going to be about the ability of a woman to control her own reproduction and abortion, but instead it was going to be about her ability to give birth to a child that was not going to be challenged by toxicity. Women give up to 1/3 of their toxic burden to their fetuses, and that's a real potential for harm there, and that is something that we've got to work on. So, as we think about diets, broadly, we want to have, preferably organic, preferably staying away from additives. Preferably, we'd be shopping around the periphery of the food store. So, we'd be in the kind of produce aisles. We'd be in the butcher aisles. Maybe we'd be in the bakery aisles some, but it would be, like fresh bread being made without all the chemicals, for example, that we would get. We'd be getting lots of veggies. We'd be getting quality proteins. If we're eating animal proteins, we'd be clear about the sources. We'd be clear about whether it was GMO or not. We'd get lots of beans. We'd be doing a lot of this cooking for ourselves. So, ultimately, as we pick our diet, we think about those sorts of things. We think about the macronutrient contents, like, are we going to get enough omega-3 fatty acids? Are we getting enough magnesium? Are we getting selenium? Are we getting zinc? Are we getting iron? Are we getting vitamin B12? With the increasing trend towards being vegetarians or being pegans, which is kind of a pescatarian, or being a true flat out vegan, where's B12 going to come from? And do we need to take that as part of a quality supplement? And I would say for vegetarians and vegans, absolutely. And for pescatarians, particularly since a lot of pescatarians have fish just 1 to 2 times a week, they need to make sure that they're getting enough B12. a good study was done a number of years back by Neil Bernard and Donna Herlock and others who looked at PMS symptoms and the benefits of a vegetarian diet for reducing PMS. And it probably was the influence upon the metabolism of the estrogens, partly playing a role in having less inflammatory estrogens and leading to less estrogen dominance. So that's important, and then as we move forward, many of the problems that we think of as unique to women's health, aren't all that unique. Like both men and women can be insulin resistant. Both men and women can have heart disease. Both men and women are going to get certain forms of cancer. Both men and women are, prone to getting COVID when there's an epidemic. But, picking a diet that meets those needs. So, if a woman walks into the office and she's mid-40s and she has a normal BMI, we're going to look at her differently than a woman with a significantly elevated BMI. And if a woman walks into the office with a normal or relatively lowish BMI and she has a low skeletal muscle mass, we're going to look at that differently than someone who has a higher skeletal muscle mass. We'll have different protein intakes. We'll have different phytonutrient intakes. We'll look at omega-3 fatty acids differently. We'll look at insulin signaling differently. These are all things that play a role. It is clear that, as Dr. Deanna Minich has clearly referenced, it's clear that having a broad range of fruits and vegetables, having lots of different colors, so, not restricting yourself to just a few vegetables or fruit makes a big difference. I heard Alton Brown, the cook on the Food Network, a few years back, probably a decade back now, talking about the variety that we eat in the diet. And he said, like, the average American eats something, I think it was like 6 to 10 fruits and vegetables a year. And, which doesn't sound too bad. There's some variety there. But he was quick to point out that, like, if you ate a Red Delicious apple and a Macintosh apple, that would be 2 of the reported numbers. So, when you start thinking about it, seeing how much different vegetables and fruits you can get in becomes really important. The other thing Alton Brown pointed out was that the average person eats 100 foods a year, or 100 brands of food a year. And so this was, you may have mustard, and that would obviously counts as one. But if you have Grey Poupon mustard and you have French's mustard and you have, Stonewall Farms, British pub or traditional pub style mustard, that would be 3 different ones out of that 100. We don't eat very much variety. So eating a variety of all these fruits and vegetables plays a really, really important role. Deanna Minich, who's talked about the rainbow diet and everything recently, has talked about, just let's create kind of a plant diversity index, something that we can have some fun with. And, fun with in terms of counting how many fruits and vegetables you had. Last night, for example, we had some fish and we ended up having spinach with it. We had some cherry tomatoes with it. We had a shallot with it. We had thyme with it. We had some basil with it. There was olives from the olive oil. There was, we had some pasta with it. So we had some wheat. And, that's about 7 or 8 in a meal. Could have been much higher if we had used a different herb blend and tossed in a few more herbs. We probably had some fennel in it because we had thrown in some Pernod. We had saffron in it, another spice. So the list goes on, and you can just play this game of how many are you going to have in a day. We got to a meal recently where there were 40 different plants represented in that meal. And it was kind of a French country, Southern French kind of style seafood soup. And it had an incredible complexity. So, when you think about diets, the diets are going to be what helps you achieve your health goals, what's good for you. As women become perimenopausal to postmenopausal, want to make sure getting enough calcium on a daily basis. So, while the requirement's about 1,200 milligrams a day, a generally healthy diet provides about 600, so you need to supplement with 600. And the final thing I'd kind of say in this discussion as we're getting ready to wrap up is that a lot of people will say eating a good diet brings you everything you need. And that's really not the case. Frankly, most of us don't eat truly a good diet. And so a good quality multiple vitamin becomes important. There's one called Phytomulti from Metagenics, which has a great profile of antioxidants and inflammation molecules and has been clinically tested and actually shown to reduce oxidized LDL. So thank you all for listening to this introduction. When we come back with the fourth session, which will be the 6th of May, we'll dive into specifics about specific nutrients and nutritional supplements for women who are perimenopausal. So, and postmenopausal. So thank you all today. And I hope you have a good day. I hope you'll join us next week, next Thursday at 11. If you're interested in hearing about cardiovascular health, that's coming up at 12 noon today. And we have a really special event coming up on the 24th of April. Dr. Michael Stone, Susan Buell, Courtney Suter, and myself are going to be doing 90 minutes of recreation and visioning. And that's going to take place Saturday, 24th of April at 9 a.m. So Pacific Daylight Time on Joseph Lamb, MD, right here. So thank you and have a great day.